Cornelius Vanderbilt has been described as an illiterate brute with a short temper, who was hated or feared by most people he met. And yet, he's also one of the wealthiest men in history, an incredibly shrewd and cunning business magnate who was once the richest man in the world. In fact, when he died, he reportedly had more money than was held in the entire US Treasury at the time. You see, before there was Rockefeller or Henry Ford, there was Cornelius Vanderbilt, who's been dubbed the original robber baron, the term for successful industrialists who amassed giant fortunes through extremely ruthless business practices. But it's hard to deny that Cornelius is one of the greatest rags to riches stories there ever was. Cornelius's ancestors had originally come to America as servants, so Cornelius's rise from nothing to unimaginable wealth and power is truly fascinating. Let's now travel back in time to the early 1800s and see where it all began. At the age of just 11 years old, Cornelius dropped out of school and went to work on his father's ferry in New York Harbor, which transported goods across the river. After learning the trade, Cornelius wanted to start his own business doing the same kind of thing, which meant he needed a boat. His mother was a farmer, and while she didn't have a lot of money, she had some savings, which she agreed to loan to her son, $100 to be exact, which would be enough for him to buy his own small sailboat. There was one caveat though. In order for Cornelius to get the loan from his mum, he had to clear an extremely rocky field so that she could farm it. Cornelius had always had an extremely strong work ethic, and so he immediately agreed. But it soon became clear removing so many rocks from the field was going to take too long, so he managed to convince other local kids to help him with the job, and in return he promised they'd get free rides on his new boats. Together they cleared the field, so his mum gave him the $100 loan, and Cornelius bought his first boat at the age of just 16. Cornelius then began transporting both freight and passengers between Staten Island and Manhattan. Of course, there was plenty of competition from other ship owners doing the same thing, but Vanderbilt's strategy was to undercut everyone else and offer the cheapest fares on the market. He quickly gained a reputation for his reliable and affordable ferry services. And here's the crucial bit. After repaying back his mother for the loan, he reinvested all the profits he made back into the business. This meant he soon was able to buy another ship, and then another ship, and then another ship. This is basically the capitalist blueprint for success. It's really not that different to how Jeff Bezos built Amazon. You initially live frugally yourself and reinvest all the business profits straight back into more growth, and do this over and over again to build your empire. And because Cornelius worked so relentlessly hard, it wasn't long before he had a whole fleet of ships transporting both people and goods across a variety of different routes. People even started nicknaming him the Commodore. But then Cornelius got an even bigger breakthrough with the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain, when the American government gave him a lucrative contract to help transport soldiers on his ships. Somehow though, despite working such long hours, at the age of 19, Cornelius found time to marry his cousin, and later went on to have 13 children with her. Although he wouldn't find time to be a good husband or father, there are many reports of Cornelius neglecting them and having a very unhappy family life. In fact, at one point, he even had his wife briefly committed to an insane asylum. And a few years later, he committed one of his sons to an insane asylum as well, simply because he was having epileptic fits, which Cornelius saw as a sign of weakness and mental derangement. But back on the business side of things, trade was booming, and by the late 1820s, Cornelius had identified how to step his business up to another level: steamboats. He knew the steamboat technology was much more efficient than the ships he'd been using, and so he began investing heavily into buying steamboats instead. And once again, he used the same tactics that he had with his sailboats, initially undercutting every single competitor so that he had the cheaper prices and thus stole all their customers. At one point, he even started offering some boat trips for free. To Cornelius, it didn't matter if he was making a loss on every trip, because his logic was simple. As long as he had more money than his competitors, he could quickly bankrupt them by taking all their customers, and then once they were out of business, he'd raise his own prices to more sustainable levels. These ruthless tactics did indeed bankrupt several other business owners, but in many cases, Cornelius would simply buy their businesses at a reduced price once the ship owners realized they couldn't compete with Cornelius's pricing. There were also a few larger steamboat companies who simply paid Cornelius a lump sum of money to leave the area and not compete on the same trade routes. For example, when Cornelius started operating on the Hudson River, a company called the Steamboat Association, who also operated there, paid him $100,000 to stop operating his ships in their territory. For them, it was cheaper to pay Cornelius off than try to compete with his low prices. Of course, every time Cornelius got a big payout like this, or he bought out a competitor at a discounted rate, his own fleet just got bigger, and thus his power and wealth increased further. To Cornelius, making money was a game, and he was determined to win. However, even as Cornelius's wealth grew, he would always be considered an outsider by the wealthy elite. His lack of school education didn't help there either, as Cornelius struggled to write properly, and the way he looked and spoke was certainly not how most of the upper class looked and spoke. But Cornelius used his working class beginnings to his advantage. He advertised his ships as the people's line, navigation, affordable ships for normal everyday people. But Cornelius was never content with what he had, and in 1949, Cornelius identified his next big moneymaker, the California Gold Rush. Now, you may have heard the stat that the people who got the richest during the gold rush were often the people selling the pickaxes, not the people actually looking for gold, because there were so many people doing that. But if you want to know who got the richest of all from the gold rush, it was the ones transporting people to get there. You see, after gold was discovered in California, literally hundreds of thousands of people were traveling there hoping to get rich. The largest mass migration in American history. But California wasn't yet linked to the rest of the country by rail, and Cornelius wanted to cash in on this, so he immediately began offering boat trips to California. Of course, several other people did this too, but where Cornelius differentiated himself is that he found a new route to California via Nicaragua, which was about 600 miles shorter than the route via Panama everyone else was using. He agreed an exclusive deal with the government of Nicaragua, and as a result, Cornelius's trips were faster and cheaper than the competition, and thus he attracted far more customers. As more and more people flocked to the gold rush, it was Cornelius who was cashing in on every single trip. But in 1853, Cornelius did something that he'd basically never done before. He took a vacation. He was about to turn 60 years old, and had been working pretty much non-stop ever since he was a kid. So he decided to finally have a proper break and bought a gigantic yacht to go on a tour of Europe with his family. And immediately, everything went wrong. He'd left management of his new transport business in Nicaragua to two men called Morgan and Garrison, who were partners in the business. But they ended up betraying him and making a shady deal with the new president of Nicaragua, a man named William Walker, who'd forcefully taken charge of the country. The deal basically meant Cornelius's exclusive rights to operate his ships throughout the country would instead be given to just Morgan and Garrison instead. When Cornelius found out, he sent them one of the shortest and most ominous letters ever. "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I'll ruin you. Yours truly, Cornelius Vanderbilt." And that's exactly what he did. Cornelius immediately set up another transit company nearby and used his classic trick of offering ridiculously low prices to steal customers. He then refused to transport passengers to or from Nicaragua to create a blockade of the country. He also convinced the nearby countries to not recognize Walker's new government, and eventually, he helped start a war to completely overthrow the new government in Nicaragua. Basically, as Cornelius had stated in his letter, he had completely ruined those who had crossed him. By this point, Cornelius was nearly 60 years old, and when most people get to the age of 60, they're looking to retire and wind down for a more relaxed life. But not Cornelius. He was about to monopolize an entirely different industry. But before that, let's quickly go back to his personal life. Because in 1868, Cornelius' wife died, the one he briefly sent to an insane asylum. And then, just 1 year later, Cornelius married a different woman, called Frank Armstrong Crawford. And yes, I double-checked that wasn't a mistake. His wife's name was indeed Frank. This was supposedly because Frank's parents had agreed to name their child after their best friend, and they'd obviously just assumed they were having a boy. But when they had a girl, they still stuck with the name Frank anyway, as agreed. So anyway, Cornelius married Frank, who was more than 40 years younger than him. And as if that wasn't weird enough, this woman called Frank, who was 40 years younger than Cornelius, was another one of his cousins. I'm not joking. Cornelius' first marriage was to his cousin Sophia, but with her dead, a year later he was now marrying another of his cousins called Frank. And look, I know marrying a cousin was more common back then, but still, the guy's been all over the world, yet both his wives were his cousins. So Cornelius' personal life was still as weird as ever, but business-wise, he was really just getting started. You see, Cornelius was always looking to the future, and just like he'd previously identified steamboats as the next revolutionary technology, now he was looking at railroads. He realized more and more shipments were happening not by boat, but by train. And so if he wanted to continue to dominate transportation, that's where he needed to focus. So Cornelius began selling off his fleet of ships, and instead began investing in railroads. Now, until Cornelius got involved in the railroad business, there was a huge amount of different railway services that were independently owned. But Cornelius started connecting railroads between different regions and building an interconnected network. He wanted to consolidate all these different railways into one giant railroad empire. And by doing this, he began to build a monopoly in railroad transportation. Of course, as always, Cornelius reinvested most of the profits to buy even more railroads and expand even faster. Before long, he'd built the largest railroad in the world. Now, in his final years of life, Cornelius did start diverting some of his huge wealth towards philanthropy. For example, he established the Vanderbilt University for $1 million, which at the time was the largest charitable gift in American history. But around this time, Cornelius grew increasingly ill and became bedridden. Despite his weakened state, he was still his usual fiery, aggressive self. For example, when he saw members of the media outside his house to report on his illness, he had to be physically restrained after going outside to attack them. But after many months of fighting his illness, Cornelius died in 1877, aged 82. The New York Times announced his death, stating the immediate cause of his death was exhaustion, brought on by long suffering from a complication of chronic disorders. At the time of his death, his fortune was worth around $100 million, but adjusting for inflation, that today would have been around $200 billion. It's estimated that on paper, he had around 1/9 of all the American currency in circulation at the time. And yet, despite that, he lived a relatively modest life. He consistently plowed almost all his income and his time into the business. When he died, around 90% of his fortune went to his oldest and favorite son, and then he split the rest between his other many children, most of which he viewed as weak and undeserving. Cornelius Vanderbilt was clearly a polarizing figure, hated by many, but normally with a grudging respect. Even his enemies would have to admit that he drastically improved and expanded transportation, first through sailboats, then steamboats, and eventually railroads. And in the process, he'd helped connect different parts of the country together, allowing for much easier transport of both people and goods and at an affordable price. In many ways, he shaped the American economy more than any other entrepreneur had before him. And it's quite amazing that he turned that initial $100 loan from his mum into a fortune that very few other people in history would ever match. However, if you want to find out the historical person who was even richer than Cornelius, just click this video right here. Trust me, this one is a really wild ride. I'll hopefully see you there. Cheers.